Story number 1. You never expect your family's curse to begin with something as mundane as walking home from school. But I suppose that's what makes it worse, how easily evil blends into the ordinary. The first time I felt its presence, I wasn't alone, and yet I never felt more isolated in my life. My little cousin's screams that winter night still echo in my memory, even though no one else could hear what she did. We didn't know back then, but we had already stepped into something ancient, patient, and endlessly cruel. It all started because our school was right next to the old graveyard. The kids, including me, used to cut through the tombstones like it was just part of the sidewalk. There was an odd hush in that space, the air too still, the birds too quiet, but no one paid attention. We were loud, careless, unaware. In our culture, you can't be disrespectful to the graves of those departed, or they will haunt you and your family as revenge. But what does a group of kids know about respect for the dead? We laughed, ran, stepped over headstones like they were playground obstacles, and then the man showed up. My little cousin was the first to see him, a quiet man standing in her father's room. She said it was a man. She was barely 5, but the way she described him was too vivid. Black clothes, no eyes, and a grin that didn't belong to any human. That winter night we were playing near the school when she froze mid-step. Her face changed, twisting in terror. She suddenly started crying, saying people were crying and screaming at her, but none of us heard a thing. The wind was still. The silence pressed in. We ran home with her trembling in our arms. That wasn't the only time it reached out to us. My uncle had left us alone one evening at my aunt's house. He went out to fetch an old television from my grandparents' attic. The moment he stepped out the door, something changed. The temperature dropped, the lights flickered, and then we heard it. Metal chains dragging slowly across the wooden floor. We heard chains dragging and heavy breathing. The sound got closer, as if whatever it was crawling toward the living room. Then, as if someone had flipped a switch, it all stopped. We looked toward the window and saw my uncle walking past. He had returned. Whatever was in that house vanished the moment he came back. After that, it seemed to pick us off one by one. My father was doing laundry when he felt it, a strong push, like someone wanted to throw him down the stairs. My dad felt the strong push while he was home alone doing laundry, and I started seeing something in my closet. Something about the man in my closet in my sister's room. The closet door never closed all the way after that. A year passed, maybe more. Things were calm, almost too calm. That's when we let our guard down. My cousin and I were playing in front of the old church when it hit us again. We both heard someone crying even though we were alone. A soft, choked sob. Not like a ghost in the movies, but the sound of real grief. Then came the move. We thought a new city would mean a fresh start. We were wrong. My mom was woken up one night by a woman's voice calling out for Lisa, which isn't her name. The voice was just outside her bedroom, desperate, almost friendly. But when she opened the door, the hallway was empty. My younger brother started praying compulsively. He was scared all the time, but we couldn't explain why. He wouldn't walk through the house alone anymore. He slept with the lights on and never made eye contact with mirrors. Then the laundry room began to whisper. My sister and father both heard a woman say, "Hi," from the laundry room. No one was there. My sister was the next to fall victim. Sleep paralysis hit her hard and often. She'd see a demonic woman drooling on her face, and she'd wake up sitting upright and would feel the drool on her forehead. She tried sleeping in different rooms. She switched beds. Nothing helped. One night, she got up to use the bathroom. The hallway light was on. That's when she saw it, standing in the hallway, staring at her. A completely black figure. Not a shadow, not a trick of the eye, but something dense, like it absorbed the light around it. She didn't scream. She didn't move. She ran straight back into her room, locked the door, and didn't sleep until morning. From then on, it became bolder, more real. I started catching it in my periphery, in my room, in the hallway, in the kitchen, on the stairs. It was everywhere. Tonight, I heard it humming. I heard it humming and moving inside my closet. Just 5 notes, repeated, and it wasn't the man anymore. It was a woman. Even my baby cousin, barely able to form full sentences, said he could hear one. He mentioned the man in my uncle's room at my grandparents' house and now refuses to go there. We thought we left it behind. Changed homes, changed towns, changed everything, but it followed us. It changed too. First a man, now a woman. Always just out of reach, always just out of sight, but never truly gone. I am genuinely scared of this demonic presence and don't know what to do to rid me and my family of it. And the worst part is this. I don't think it wants to hurt us. It wants to stay. We thought we were done. After all the running, the praying, the sage burning, we believed we'd broken the curse. But nothing evil ever really dies. It just waits. 3 days ago, I visited my grandmother's house again. She's old now, barely remembers my name. But when I walked into the hallway, I saw the door to the attic slightly open. I didn't go near it. Later that night, my phone buzzed. My cousin had sent a voice message. She said her son, the same baby cousin who once saw the man in my uncle's room, had drawn something. She sent the picture. It was a black figure, tall, with no eyes, and next to it, a woman. Her mouth was open too wide, and there were streaks on the child's paper, red crayon drawn to look like drool. He'd never seen it. No one had ever told him. And yet, there it was. He called it the couple. Of course, I don't think it ever meant to scare us. I think it was trying to become part of us. First the man, then the woman. Now both. Watching, waiting, teaching our bloodline to recognize them by face. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And it never, ever leaves. Story number 2. There are moments in life you can't unsee, fragments that sear into memory and refuse to fade. This one happened in the most unlikely of places, a psychiatric ward. And yet, it was the sanest thing I've ever witnessed. If you've never questioned whether someone beside you was truly human, maybe you've been lucky. I wasn't. He was my only friend there. And one afternoon, for 10 silent seconds, his eyes turned yellow, like headlights slicing through fog. No one else noticed. No one reacted. Only me. And I've been haunted ever since. There was a time in my life when the walls around me were padded. The clocks had no hands, and freedom came with a clipboard. I don't talk about it much, the months I spent in the psych ward, but one moment has anchored itself deep into my mind. Unshakable. I was in there for reasons too tangled to explain here. Suffice it to say, I wasn't well, but I wasn't hallucinating. That's important to understand. Hallucinations have never, ever been an issue for me. If what I saw was a hallucination, then it means I've had one incident over the course of my entire life, which seems very unlikely. Among the cast of broken souls in that place, I made a single real connection. His name was Darren. He was tall, in his mid-30s, and had this subtle, grounded energy that drew people in without trying. He was funny, grounded, and it's important to the story to mention that he was black. He was around his mid-50s and had these deep brown eyes like coffee. He made the days less bleak, and in a place like that, even a smile feels like a revolution. We'd sit together during group therapy, an endless loop of recovery mantras and therapists with two smooth voices. The chairs were arranged in a circle like a ritual, and the fluorescent lights above buzzed like insects in heat. The day it happened felt like any other. At first, I remember the air being unusually heavy, the kind that makes your skin feel too tight. The therapist was droning on about something, grief processing or assertive communication. I think my mind was drifting when I noticed Darren beside me starting to tremble. Now, twitching wasn't uncommon there. Hell, pacing, muttering, even self-talk were part of the scenery. But this was different. His hands were clenching the sides of his chair like something was moving through him. Not panic, not a seizure. It looked internal, like his bones were humming. I turned to him fully, and that's when I saw his eyes. They weren't brown anymore. They were yellow. Not a hazel, not golden. A bright, unnatural yellow, like high beams in fog. The kind of yellow that doesn't belong in a human body. The light from them didn't reflect. It seemed to pierce. I froze. There was no other reaction I could manage. What was I looking at? I glanced around the circle. The therapist kept talking like nothing was happening. No one even looked his way. I expected someone to stop mid-sentence, to ask if he was okay, to at least blink, but no one did. They were all statues, locked into that moment, except me. 10 seconds? Maybe less. Then his shoulders dropped. He let out a deep exhale, and when I looked again, the yellow was gone. His eyes faded back to brown. Just like that, it was over. We never spoke about it. Not once. I had 1,000 questions swirling inside me, but none dared pass through my lips. Was he even aware it happened? Had he felt something move through him? Or worse, had something been watching from behind those eyes? In the days that followed, he was just Darren again. Funny, patient, kind. But I noticed small things. How he'd sometimes stare into the corner of the room, eyes unfocused. How his hand would tremble ever so slightly when he thought no one was watching. And how, once, I caught him checking his reflection in the window as if unsure it was still him. Whatever had passed through him, it had left something behind. A residue, a shift in the air. But I didn't push it because I was scared. Not just of what I saw, but of what it meant that I was the only one who saw it. I left the ward weeks later. He stayed. I don't know what became of him, but that moment never left me. I still don't know what it meant or why I was the only one who saw this. Even now, years later, remembering this, I'm still shocked and wonder if I witnessed someone get possessed by a demon temporarily. Maybe the mind tries to explain the unexplainable. Maybe we invent the supernatural to make sense of fractures in reality. But I know what I saw. Those eyes weren't human, and for 10 seconds, I wasn't in a hospital. I was in something else's presence. Kisa, and whatever it was, it looked right at me. Story number 3. They told me not to drive through that stretch after sunset. I didn't listen. Some roads remember pain. Others carry it. What follows a man who doesn't believe in spirits? Something waiting to be seen. I saw it in the mirror first, where truth hides in plain sight. If I had kept my eyes forward, maybe we wouldn't have vanished. I have a friend who shared this story with me. He's from Mexico. His voice trembled slightly when he said it, like something heavy sat behind those words. It's about his uncle and his uncle's friend who found themselves in a rather disturbing situation. Now, I know how vague that sounds, but when I heard the details, something inside me chilled, not because it was terrifying in the usual way, but because it felt incomplete, like a warning whispered too late. Back then, they lived in the deep countryside of Oaxaca. The roads were barely paved, the sky darker than ink, and superstition ran thicker than blood. His uncle and a friend were returning home from the farmer's market in a beat-up flatbed truck. They didn't say much during the ride, just the hum of tired engines and the rustle of crate. It was his uncle who noticed it first. He peered into the rearview mirror and saw something that shouldn't have been there. He said it looked like a horse about 150 feet behind them. But it wasn't galloping. It wasn't trotting. It simply glided. No sound, no hooves kicking up dust, just movement, smooth, deliberate, relentless. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. Still there. The longer he stared, the more wrong it felt. He didn't wake his friend. Maybe he thought he was imagining things. Maybe he didn't want to sound like a fool. But the horse, or whatever it was, kept following. Then something strange happened. Every time he looked away from the mirror, he felt lighter. But when he glanced back, there it was, closer than before. So he stopped looking. He couldn't make out its features clearly and didn't think much of it. That's what he told himself. But even when he tried to relax, something gnawed at him. That primal fear older than reason. He began to nod off, lulled by the gentle bounce of the truck. Then the dreams came. In those dreams, he saw the road folding into itself like a ribbon, trees melting into shadows, and the horse no longer behind the truck, but right next to him. Its head turned toward the window, face blank, eyes hollow, yet somehow furious. He woke up with a jerk, except he wasn't in the truck anymore. They found the truck the next morning, parked neatly by the roadside. Engine cold, headlights off, crates untouched, but no trace of the two men. Locals said they must have run off, stolen, kidnapped. Others, those with deeper roots in Oaxaca, shook their heads. They'd heard of such stories before, of something old that wandered that road looking for lost souls, something that hated being seen. That road had been a migration path once, they said, where horses carried bodies to unmarked graves, where blood seeped into dirt and never dried. They believed the mirror wasn't showing what was behind, but what was underneath. My friend never spoke of his uncle again. The family refused to investigate. No funerals, no obituaries, just silence. Eventually, he drifted off to sleep, and maybe that's when it claimed him. I drove through Oaxaca last summer just once. I made sure the rearview mirror was covered with cloth the whole way. Some say that's foolish. I say it's the only reason I made it back. Story number 4. There are places in this world that refuse to explain themselves. You can map them, mark them, name them, but they don't care. They remain strange, quietly breathing something ancient beneath our understanding. When I was 18, I went somewhere I shouldn't have. Not because it was forbidden, but because some spaces hold old anger, and they don't forget who comes to visit. It wasn't what we saw that changed me. It was what followed. Some hauntings wear sheets and chains. Others ride the wind or move in silence through the dark. Ours swung. Have you ever watched something move that shouldn't? Not blown by wind, not pushed by hand, just moving like it's alive, like it's watching you back. This story isn't about a ghost, it's about a warning, and how sometimes evil doesn't chase you, it waits for you to come back. I grew up in central North Carolina, a quiet enough place with its fair share of legends. One of those stories is about a patch of land called the Devil's Trampling Ground, a barren circle in the woods where nothing grows. They say the devil paces there at night, plotting his schemes, and that if you sleep there, strange things will happen. You might wake up outside the circle. You might see or hear something you can't explain. I never believed any of it. But one night, when we were young and dumb and full of confidence, my friends and I decided to see it for ourselves. Midnight, one flashlight, no plan. The walk through the woods was worse than I expected. Trees pressed in around us. The silence stretched tight, broken only by the sound of our own breathing. Finally, we stumbled into that circle. It looked just like the story said, a round patch of dirt, no grass, no weeds, just absence. We stayed maybe 15 minutes, heard some animals, nothing too strange. It felt underwhelming, to be honest, until it wasn't. Leaving the woods, I started to feel off. Not scared exactly, but uneasy, like the air had changed. My skin felt too tight, like something was watching us. That's the only way I can put it. Back in the car, I sat in the passenger seat while my buddy drove. 2 more friends sat behind us. No one spoke much. We drove in silence, our eyes darting out the windows. That's when we hit the four-way stop. There was a daycare on the corner, dimly lit by a flickering street lamp. And that's where we saw it. 4 swings, 3 still, 1 moving, back and forth, smooth, rhythmic, as if someone were still on it. No wind, no animals nearby, no one else around, and the swing never slowed. We watched it longer than we should have. I don't know why. Part of me hoped it would just stop. Another part wanted to believe it was explainable. Maybe someone had just jumped off and we missed it. Maybe wind currents, maybe anything. But it kept swinging, and the feeling came back. That same cold prickling on the back of my neck. The sense that something had followed us out of those woods, that it hadn't stayed behind. That swing wasn't just moving. It was staring. We drove away in silence again. Not one of us said a word for miles. I've gone back over that night in my head so many times, 'cause could we have imagined it? Could fear have played tricks on us? Maybe. Maybe not. What stuck with me wasn't just the swing. It was how it made me feel. Like we'd trespassed somewhere sacred or cursed. Like something ancient had looked up and noticed us. And once something like that notices you, it doesn't forget. I never returned to the devil's trampling ground. None of us did. We didn't talk about it much after that, either. There was no need to. Some places don't want visitors. And if you insist on going, they might just follow you home. Story number 5. She never watched TV, never saw a horror movie in her life. So how did she describe something that haunts even modern nightmares? The thing she saw had hooves, a man's face, and only 1 antler. When I asked my great-grandma if she ever feared death, she said, "I already met what's waiting there." She never joked. She never lied. And yet, she swore that the devil once lived inside her closet. At age 94, she looked at a toy alien and whispered, "Them's the things that gave me the stroke." My great-grandmother, Gigi, was the kind of woman who knitted sweaters while humming church hymns, yet never bothered to say grace at dinner. She grew up in the dusty fields of northern Dakota, a child of immigrants with thick accents and hands calloused from hardship. Her father spoke English, her mother only German, though she was almost completely deaf. It created a house where words barely flowed and emotions became gestures. Gigi learned to communicate using an odd hybrid of signs, squinted eyes, and intuition. But that language couldn't help her the day she met the thing in the closet. Gigi had always been stubborn. One afternoon, when she was around 10, she disobeyed her mother, argued, flailed her arms, nearly struck her. Her mother, stone-faced, grabbed her wrist mid-swing and locked eyes with her. Without saying a word, she pointed to the narrow closet in the hallway and left the room. That closet was the family's punishment box. Every child had spent time in there. So, sulking, Gigi marched toward it, opened the door, and froze. What stood inside wasn't darkness. It wasn't clothes. It was alive. It had hooves, she always said. It had a man's face. But there was fur. One side of its head had a big antler. Just one. Dirty hair, dirty eyes. She slammed the door shut and screamed. Her mother came rushing in. opening the closet again, but it was empty. Gigi never liked retelling that part. She wasn't dramatic about it. She wasn't looking for attention. She just remembered. She didn't call it the devil out loud back then, but she knew what it was, and she never opened that closet again. Years passed. Gigi grew older, quieter, married, raised children. Her life was filled with casseroles, piano hymns, and carefully folded napkins. She was never the joking kind. The idea of her playing a prank was laughable, but something about her never lost that look, that pause in her voice when she remembered things others wouldn't believe. Them's the things that came and got me, she said once at a pizza restaurant, holding up a tiny plastic alien. She was in her 90s, fresh off a mild stroke, surrounded by family. I was a dumb kid, busy wasting quarters on an arcade machine. The alien toy came from one of those vending egg dispensers. It was tiny, cheap, giving a peace sign, but Gigi stared at it like it was a message from another world. "There, why I'm in the hospital," she added. My mom chuckled, thinking it was a joke. But Gigi's face didn't change, and I noticed something. Her hand was trembling. Not from age, but from memory. We brushed it off. Old woman, stroke, hallucination, right? Except Gigi had no cable TV, no sci-fi, no idea what gray aliens even were. Yet somehow she described them without knowing. What if it wasn't just the devil in the closet? What if there was more? There were little signs throughout her life, odd gaps in memory, fleeting moments of fear when she looked into mirrors or shadows. No one took it seriously. After all, she raised 6 kids in their perfect attendance at Sunday school. But when she thought no one was watching, she'd flinch at certain things. Lightning storms, animal skulls, the sound of someone knocking only once. In her final years, she kept a rosary under her pillow. Not out of habit. She wasn't even a practicing Catholic, but as if it warded something off. She never trusted closets after that first encounter. In every house she lived in, her closets were filled with junk, sealed tight. Things hide in emptiness, she once muttered when asked why. Sometimes, when the house was quiet, she'd stare at the hallway as if expecting something. Once, after a church gathering, she told me, "The devil don't need fire, he just needs silence." And then she spilled, the kind of spill people wear when they survive something too large to explain. Mokume. Story number 6. You know the fear is real when pain follows you into the waking world. I've survived dozens of sleep paralysis episodes, but nothing like this. Nothing that left a mark. My ribs still burn where it bit me. No punctures, just searing red skin and the memory of teeth. People say it's science, REM sleep, motor inhibition. But how do you explain bruises from a dream? That black figure didn't just haunt me. It hunted me. And this time, it made contact. I've battled sleep paralysis for as long as I can remember. It started as a child, short, silent nightmares where my body refused to move and shadows pressed in from the edges of my vision. But this time, something changed. Something followed me back. That morning, I wasn't even supposed to sleep. I was already awake, feeling sick, heavy, not right. I decided to lie down for a bit and nap it off. I was on my side, facing away from our bedroom door on the far side of our king-size bed. I felt my body relax and fell asleep rather quickly. Even now, recalling the exact moment things shifted sends a cold shiver down my spine. I remember the wall, the shape of the closed bathroom door, the faint patterns in the paint. Normal, still, familiar, and then came the silence. That deep, unnatural silence that doesn't belong in daytime naps. It was the first sign. I then tried to move and couldn't. As I have been through this many times, I was already mentally telling myself I was in sleep paralysis and needed to focus on trying to move a little, such as wiggling my finger. However, I'm already feeling scared and can feel my heart racing. The fear was instinctive, deep in my chest like an alarm bell going off. But it wasn't just the paralysis. It was the pressure in the room. As if something had entered, I then hear the sound of our bedroom door open and close behind me, as our bedroom door makes a very specific and loud popping noise. Except I knew I had locked that door. I always do. When I'm home alone, that popping noise was real, not imagined. My brain doesn't fabricate details like that when I'm dreaming. It was the sound that set the nightmare in motion. I thought maybe it was my husband. Maybe he came home early and would help me shake it off. But then came the running, heavy, deliberate stomping, circling the bed, fast, aggressive, malicious. They stopped directly in front of me, and I see a very large and tall black figure standing in front of our bathroom door. This is the same figure I encounter in almost all of my sleep paralysis experiences. The shape towered there, just standing. No face, no sound, just presence. It made no move for several seconds, seconds that stretched into years inside my frozen mind. I couldn't turn my head, but I felt its gaze like a flame on my skin. And then it lunged. Before I can register any other thoughts, the large figure lunges at me. I feel this heavy weight of this thing on my body as it feels like it's crushing me, especially in the ribs. I tried to scream. I tried to twist away, but I couldn't. My arms were still locked beneath my pillow, and my body might as well have been carved in stone. That weight, no dream had ever felt that heavy. And then came the pain. That's when I feel teeth burying into my ribs, an intense feeling of pain and pressure. I can't describe it in any way that does justice. This wasn't a bite like a dog or like a person. It was deeper, hungrier, as though whatever this entity was, it didn't just want to hurt me. It wanted to consume something within me. I can quite literally feel this thing's mouth opening and closing in different spots along the side of my ribs. The tearing sensation wasn't imagined. I still remember the heat of it, the rhythm of its gnawing, like a predator trying to dig through my side. It felt like it was searching for something under my skin. I was mentally screaming, repeating my husband's name in my head over and over, wishing, begging, and then I snapped out of it. Next thing I know, I sit straight up in bed, my heart racing. I broke out in a cold sweat and could still feel tingles on the left of my ribs. The room was quiet. The door was shut. No sign of the figure, but the panic didn't leave. My eyes dart around the room, finding it completely empty. I lift up my shirt to inspect my side. The skin is not broken, but the whole left side of my rib cage is bright red. That redness stayed for hours. It throbbed like a bruise forming under the surface. I checked my bed, the mirror, every inch of the room. Nothing out of place. No rational explanation. I've done a good amount of research on sleep paralysis, and I understand the scientific explanation for it. But waking up physically marked from these experiences is brand new to me. I know what the articles say: REM, atonia, hallucinations, brain chemistry, but none of them explain why I woke up with a mark. None of them explain why this entity has followed me for years, growing stronger. That night changed me. I used to treat sleep paralysis as a nuisance, an unfortunate quirk of my biology. But now I'm afraid to sleep, not just because of the fear, but because I think it's learning how to cross over. I find it hard to believe there's nothing evil or demonic about these attacks. I'm pretty sure the sleep paralysis demon bit me. Story number 7. There are some memories I've tried to bury so deep. Even the shadows forgot them, but the attic never did. What happens when nightmares follow you in daylight and your dog knows it before you do? The scariest thing isn't the ghost in your room. It's when the ghost knows your name. Ever woken up mid-air, gripping the edge of your own bed, convinced something had tried to pull you off? I have, and that was just the beginning. Sometimes you leave the light on because you're scared. Other times, you leave it on because you know you're not alone. When I was little, my brother and I shared a small room in our old house. I had the top bunk, he took the bottom. We were just regular kids, rowdy, curious, and sometimes too stubborn to admit when something scared us. But fear has a way of turning into silence, especially when you don't want to sound crazy. There were nights I'd fall asleep peacefully and wake up hanging off the edge of the bed with one arm, heart racing, legs kicking into empty air. Next thing I knew, I was hanging off the edge of the bed with one arm, and I woke up instantly. No dreams, no warning, just the sheer panic of being pulled from sleep, literally. At first, I thought I had rolled over, maybe just tossed around in my sleep, but then it kept happening, and not just to me. My brother had a few falling incidents, too. We both laughed it off back then, trying not to admit how weird it felt. Then came the scratches. Sometimes I'd wake up with the mysterious scratches and bruises on my body when I was young. Always small, but fresh. No explanation. Our parents shrugged it off as boys being boys. But I knew better. We both did. When I turned 13, I gave the room to my brother and moved up into the attic. It felt like the grown-up thing to do. More space, more privacy. No more bunk beds, but privacy came with a price. From the first night up there, I noticed the silence wasn't complete. There were breaths in that attic, ones I didn't take. I kept the light on more often than not. The air always felt a few degrees too cold in one corner, and even when I turned off the ceiling fan, something felt like it was brushing the skin of my neck as I lay in bed. Not every night, but enough to notice. One night, I woke to 3 knocks on my door from the hallway near the next bathroom, slow and deliberate. The sound echoed like it wanted me to answer. I woke up sure as hell. I stayed frozen in bed for a full hour, too afraid to speak, too scared to move. Nothing followed, nothing entered. But the dread didn't leave either. The nightmare started the same week I slid a dream catcher under my pillow. A gift from a friend meant to keep the evil spirits out. I didn't believe in that stuff. Not really. But after that first night, I questioned everything. The first dream wasn't just dark. It was hot, blistering heat. I was chained to a stone platform, surrounded by grotesque figures, murmuring in languages I couldn't understand. The sky bled red, and the ground pulsed like a heartbeat. I woke in a sweat, heart pounding so hard it felt like it might crack a rib. I drank water, walked around, tried to calm myself. Eventually, I went back to bed and immediately fell into the same nightmare, scene for scene. This went on for 3 nights in a row. I threw the dream catcher out after the second night, buried it in the trash can outside. It didn't help. Then came something worse. A lucid dream so intense, it blurred the line between sleep and possession. I was no longer myself. I was watching from inside my own body, trapped as something else took control. There was also one dream that felt way too real, like a succubus had taken over. I tried to tell my parents. They said it was the move, the change in sleeping arrangements, stress, puberty. But no amount of growing up explains why my bed would sometimes vibrate gently as if something was breathing beneath it. Then there would be a few times where my bed would shake slightly, like low vibration, almost like a small earthquake, which isn't normal where I live. I stopped sleeping in the attic full time. I dragged my blankets down to the couch, citing acid reflux as an excuse. My dog, normally mellow, would join me. He liked routine, but late at night, he'd bolt upright, ears stiff, and stare into the hallway. He'd start barking like crazy, but there'd never be anything there. He'd growl, circle me, nuzzle my legs as if to say, "I don't know what that was, but stay close." One night, I fell asleep with my Bluetooth speaker playing lo-fi music. Something calm, soothing. The next morning, the speaker wasn't working. I figured the battery had died. Until I turned it over, the battery had melted and there was a hole in the back. You could see where it had burnt through. No short circuit, no overheating. Just damage that didn't make any sense. After that, I stopped playing music at night. I stopped doing a lot of things. But the one thing I never stopped was keeping the light on. Eventually, we moved. New house, new neighborhood, new life. Thankfully, I've moved into a new house and haven't experienced any demonic or paranormal activity since, which I am profoundly grateful for. But I'll never forget the feeling of something pulling me from my bed, or the way the attic door creaked open when I knew I had locked it, or the burn mark on that Bluetooth speaker, or the look in my dog's eyes when it barked at nothing, seeing something I couldn't. Some houses are haunted by tragedy. Mine was haunted by attention. Story number 8. It's strange what your mind will remember, even when your body wants to forget. Some nights stretch out across time like a scar, a jagged line you can't stop running your fingers over. Oh, sis, I don't scare easily. But that night, I discovered what true fear really feels like: paralyzing, primal, and worse than any nightmare. There's something deeply wrong when you realize you're not the only one seeing the impossible, especially when the other person is already losing their grip on reality. I saw a child standing outside my window, but his eyes told me he wasn't really a child anymore. Eyes. The house we lived in wasn't much to look at. Peeling paint, sagging floors, windows that didn't quite close right. It had a kind of neglected heaviness to it, as though it had absorbed too many secrets and refused to let them go. I was living with my family in a sort of beaten-down house. My mother worked late most nights, leaving me alone with her boyfriend. He was unstable, at best, a wiry man with sunken cheeks and erratic moods. His mind often wandered into strange territory, especially when he ran out of his usual fix. At the time, my mom's boyfriend was going through a psychotic episode. I never liked being alone with him. Not because he was violent, he wasn't, but because the things he said made the walls feel too close, the air too tight. He talked about spirits walking through rooms, about demons watching from corners. When he doesn't have anything to smoke, he kind of gets crazy and starts talking about ghosts, gods, and demons. One evening, he told me there was something evil in the house, something trying to get inside him. His voice was low, like he thought the walls might overhear. I laughed it off until the night I couldn't anymore. It had been a long day, and I'd fallen asleep on the couch. The TV was still on, casting flickers of light across the room. The couch was pushed against a wall beneath the big living room window. Part of the window had no blinds, just a gap where the old AC unit used to sit. I fell asleep on the couch, which was next to the big window in the living room. Oh no. I woke up suddenly. Not because of a noise, just that feeling, the one that crawls up your spine when something's off. It was around 2 or 3 o'clock when I woke. I opened my eyes, sort of disoriented, and that's when I saw him. Standing outside the window was a little boy, maybe 8 or 9. He was dressed in a baseball uniform, old-fashioned and slightly too big for his frame. But it was his face that froze me. Ash gray, lifeless. His eyes were hollow. Not empty in a physical sense, just void. He was wearing baseball attire, ashen face, and his eyes were hollow. He wasn't looking at me exactly, more like through me. Something about him felt ancient, despite his size, like he had been standing there for a very long time, just waiting. I couldn't move, not a twitch. My whole body betrayed me. Panic surged in my chest, but I was rooted to the spot. This wasn't a dream. My heart thudded like a drum, but my limbs refused to respond. I was completely paralyzed and couldn't move. I was beyond terrified at this specter just outside my window. Then he entered the room, my mom's boyfriend. His footsteps were soft, his eyes wild and unblinking. He didn't yell. He didn't question. He just stared out the same window I was frozen in front of. Then my mom's boyfriend came into the room and almost whispered to me, which gave me quite a start. "You see him too?" he asked. His voice was a whisper of both awe and fear. He walked right up to the window, pulled the blinds up further, And then he began talking to the boy. Words I couldn't hear. A one-sided conversation that chilled me more than the boy's presence. Then, just as suddenly, the boy turned, walked away into the darkness. I remember seeing the boy walk away. When I looked away for just a split second, he was gone. I never slept properly again after that. We moved not long after, but that house had taken something from me. Or maybe it left something behind in me. I brought it up later after we left the house, but my mom's boyfriend denied it ever happened. He acted like I was delusional, like none of it occurred. But I know what I saw, and worse, I know what he saw. Was the boy just a projection of his madness, or was his madness a doorway for something else to step through? I wonder, was that little boy, that entity, the demon he was talking about? Some nights I still see that face behind my eyelids, waiting. Story number 9. They called it a revival, but to me, it was always closer to a possession. I never saw God in that church, only the trembling shadows of something darker, ancient, and watching. My mother built altars in the woods, whispering to them when she thought no one was listening. I still don't know if it was prayer or pact. They said Pastor Gene spoke in tongues. I say he growled like something caged too long. The night our dog stood on 2 legs and blocked our car, my father didn't blink. He ran it over. I once saw a room full of worshipers freeze mid-scream like puppets cut from their strings. Then we all just went home. They called it a revival, but to me, it was always closer to a possession. I never saw God in that church, only the trembling shadows of something darker, ancient, and watching. My earliest memories aren't of lullabies or birthday cakes. They're of sweat-stained wooden pews, the stifling air of revival tents, and a preacher whose voice would scrape the walls like rusted nails. They said Pastor Gene spoke in tongues. I say he growled like something caged too long. My family is from a small town in East Tennessee. My father's side of the family seemed fairly normal. They were mostly tobacco farmers, poor hillbillies. But there's nothing normal about what followed. My mother came from chaos. Her eyes always held that pale glint of someone who had survived more than she would ever say. My grandfather would take my mom and aunt to bars and leave them in the car while he drank and chased women. He beat my grandmother and berated her in front of the kids. Those weren't just the stories she told in passing. They were warnings disguised as memories. They said the church saved her. I think it consumed her. I never liked the way the congregation moved. Jerky. As if something else was pulling their limbs. One night, I saw a man convulsing near the altar, not speaking in tongues, but shrieking like he'd swallowed burning coals. Pastor June knelt beside him, not praying, but watching, studying, smiling. That was the first time I thought maybe this wasn't a church at all. The night our dog stood on 2 legs and blocked our car, my father didn't blink. He ran it over. My sister once told me that before I was born, my father was chased by demons. One night, he woke up the whole family and told them they had to leave immediately or the demons would kill them. He claimed he had seen hell in a dream. My mother didn't ask questions. She gathered the kids and fled. As they drove away from the hollow, the dog, normally gentle, walked into the road. According to my sister, the dog stood on two legs and tried to block their car. My dad ran it over. He was crying and saying he could see things climbing into the trees. They didn't stop until they reached Pastor Jean's house. John opened the door before they knocked. He told them he'd been expecting them. I was born 9 years after my sister. From the moment I could walk, I was taught what it meant to be saved. Women weren't allowed to cut their hair, could only wear dresses, and weren't allowed to wear makeup. Just your usual Southern Baptist dogma. But this wasn't about modesty. It was about control. I learned that fast. My mother used to disappear into the woods for hours. Once, I followed her. I found her kneeling beside a stone circle, eyes closed, arms raised, not in prayer, but in command. She wasn't asking for protection. She was summoning something. She turned her head sharply when she sensed me. Her pupils looked wrong. For a moment, I didn't recognize her. That night, she didn't speak to me. She just stood outside my room, whispering to the dark. I once had a dream that I was in church and the lights turned an amber glow. Gene was preaching. He told the congregation to stand and follow him. They walked out into the woods and approached a well. One by one, they followed him in it. I could hear hell coming from inside that hole. It wasn't just a dream. The first time I truly feared for my soul was during a prayer meeting when I was 4. The congregation was praying over a sinner, trying to help them get saved. I was sitting in the back row while watching. I felt the room get cold, and then I heard a growl. It was the loudest, most deafening sound I've ever heard. Suddenly, everyone stopped praying like zombies. They returned to their seats, and they all sat there in silence. Eventually, we just got up and went home. But I remember tugging on my mom's sleeve, asking what had happened. She told me the spirit had passed over us and found what it needed. That night, I wet the bed and didn't sleep for days. When I was a teenager, I started asking questions. Why didn't anyone ever leave this place feeling peace? Why did people collapse in rage instead of rapture? Why did animals avoid the church or sometimes stalk it? Deer would watch through the trees with too much intelligence. A black bear once clawed the pastor's car for 20 minutes while we all waited inside the sanctuary. At a remote revival, I reached my limit. The preacher went into one of his tantrums, and the congregation started screaming and dancing around. I started praying and asked God to let me leave. The back door opened by itself. I stood up and walked out, and no one tried to stop me. My parents didn't even come looking for me until the service ended. And when they did, they barely looked at me. My mother only whispered, "You shouldn't have left." I think something wore Pastor Gene like a suit of flesh. I never saw him blink during a sermon. And when he laid hands on people, they didn't get healed. They got haunted. Gene was charismatic and would preach for hours. He'd get enraged, pant with guttural growls, and by the end of his sermons, he'd be drenched in sweat. Some people claimed he had healed them. Others said he could see into your soul. I believe he saw straight through us into something older. After one sermon, I peeked into his office. On the desk were books that weren't Bibles. They were bound in skin-toned leather and filled with symbols that made my teeth ache. When he saw me, he smiled. "Curiosity is dangerous," he said, "especially in children who see more than they should." That night, I packed a bag. I moved out when I was a teenager. My mother threw a fit, hit me, and screamed at me, and I never went back to the church. My sister still goes, but now it's a mega church with LED lights and coffee bars. They don't scream anymore, but sometimes when I see her smile during worship on social media, I wonder if the spirit ever really left, or if it simply changed its clothes. It's only now as an adult and being able to reflect upon everything do I think there was something sinister within Gene Evil, perhaps. He died a few years ago, but I always remember the way he looked consumed by something. I genuinely think that at least at the beginning, there was something seriously messed up with that church. And Gene. Story number 10. They said it wasn't possession, but I know what I saw. The way she hovered, not walked. The voice that tore from her wasn't hers. In our family, gods can speak through chosen ones. But what if it wasn't a God that chose Samara? I've replayed that moment 1,000 times, how my cousin stared through us, chanting words no one recognized. She was sick that morning. By nightfall, she was something else entirely. And though she's safe now, we all sleep with the lights on, just in case whatever it was comes back. They say every ritual in our homeland carries a price. That day, we found out what it costs when curiosity opens the wrong door. We just come back from watching a local movie, a story about a man who gets possessed by a divine spirit to protect his village. It wasn't just cinema to us. It felt like a revelation. The audience had cheered, gritted, worshipped. Some even bowed to the screen. That night, something changed in us. We began imitating the way the main character acted when the god took over his body. The rigid stares, the deep chants, the trance-like movement. It was fun at first. Pretend, like a game. My cousin Samara, always the most playful, took it further than anyone else. She started drawing the characters' sigils with chalk on our courtyard tiles, repeating phrases we barely understood. Some nights, I'd hear her whispering to herself through the wall. We laughed about it. We always laughed, until the laughter stopped. One Wednesday, her mother came home from work earlier than expected. She looked shaken, pale. We were all in the kitchen when she told us what happened. Samara hadn't gone to college that day. She had been feeling sick, her throat sore, body weak. Her father stayed behind to help her get to the hospital. While her mother stepped outside to take a phone call, it began. At first, it was a scream so loud the neighbors rushed to the door. Then, silence. Then came the sounds of movement, but no footsteps. When they entered the room, Samara wasn't in bed. She was hovering, her toes inches off the ground. Her head rolled slowly side to side, her body twitching unnaturally. Her father tried to grab her, but he couldn't hold her down. And this was a man who lifted sacks of grain with one arm. Then came the chanting, but not in any language we spoke. It wasn't Tamil. It wasn't Sanskrit. It wasn't even human, to be honest. The neighbors backed away. Someone screamed. Someone called for help. And Samara, our sweet, quiet cousin, turned toward them and grinned. That night, no one slept. No. They tried taking her to the hospital, but the staff couldn't explain her behavior. They recommended seeing a psychic. That's how far beyond medicine this had gone. We gathered in the living room and while her parents made frantic calls. One of our older cousins, Arvind, said he knew someone who performed ancient cleansing rituals. A man named Thatha Srinivasan. He was old, remote, and selective. But when Arvind explained Samara's condition, the man agreed to come. He arrived that night, tall, silent, his white beard streaked with soot. He carried nothing but a small sack of salt and a vial of oil. The moment he stepped into the house, he flinched. "There's something here," he said, "but it's not holy, all." He walked into Samara's room and immediately began a ritual, drawing symbols with salt, muttering chants under his breath. He poured the oil around her bed. Samara hissed. That's the only word I have for the sound. Her body arched, her eyes rolled back. She shouldn't have had the strength to move. She hadn't eaten in days. Then the air grew heavy, like something was pressing down on all of us. The lights flickered. Somewhere, a photo frame fell without being touched. Thatha began chanting louder, faster. Samara screamed. Hooray! And then, silence! It ended as quickly as it began. She slumped forward, gasping. Her eyes returned to normal. Her hands trembled. Later that night, she could barely speak. She said, "I could see everyone, and I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know what I was doing." Her voice was barely a whisper, as if something had drained her from the inside. She was like a puppet whose strings had just been cut. Over the next few weeks, she slowly recovered. We didn't talk about it much, not directly. But every time we walked past the temple, Samara looked away. One evening, as we sat under the banyan tree, she finally told me something that still haunts me. "I don't think it was a god," she said. "I think something else heard us pretending, and it wanted to join." Story number 11. There are some places where silence feels heavy. Not peaceful, not calm, but like something unseen is holding its breath. I never believed a room could listen. Until that night, when words summoned something that had been waiting in the dark. We were talking about angels and demons, but then something answered, not with a voice, not with a whisper, with motion. A book that hadn't moved in years fell at the exact moment we mentioned its name. Tonight, I stayed over at my friend's apartment. She lives alone in the penthouse, the very last apartment at the top of the building. The place always gave me strange feelings, not because it was old or creaky or quiet. It was something less tangible, something in the air. Her penthouse had a kind of unnatural stillness. Every sound felt amplified, like if it was echoing across something hollow. The walls were tall, made of what looked like thick wooden plaster, and the light never felt warm no matter how many lamps she had on. We'd spent the evening laughing, catching up, talking about memories. Hours passed. Somewhere between coffee and cold pizza, our conversation drifted. I started talking about faith. I'm a believer, not casually, but deeply. And when the topic came up, I didn't hold back. We began discussing spirituality, Jesus, and eventually the darker side of belief. Demonic presence. I'm a deep believer, and I started sharing my thoughts about Jesus' faith and the reality of the spiritual world. I told her that evil doesn't just exist in ideas or fairy tales. It waits in silence. It hides in pride. And sometimes it listens. She wasn't as convinced. Not that she didn't believe in spirits. She just never had a reason to fear them. Until that night. Her living room has a huge bookshelf, the kind that stretches almost to the ceiling. We were seated on the sofa about 2 meters away from it. That's when I noticed it. The air shifted. Not a breeze, not a draft, a shift. The kind that makes your skin tense, that makes you suddenly aware of your spine. It got heavier, and then it happened. Out of nowhere, a book from the top shelf just fell, landing loudly between us. My heart stopped. I didn't move. She gasped and froze. The timing was chilling. It happened just as we were talking about demons, Jesus, and our Savior. She went pale and stared at the floor where the book lay open. It wasn't just any book. It had been on the top shelf, untouched for months. I told you, I said softly. See, this is exactly what happens when you call them by name. They don't like it and will try to scare you. So I said it calmly, on the outside, but inside, I was tightening like a knot. I refused to give it energy. I left the book where it was and shifted the topic slightly. But the air wouldn't go back to normal. She clutched her knees and barely smiled anymore. We sat there, pretending everything was fine. But it wasn't. The pressure in the room obtruding, like the atmosphere was pushing down on our lungs. I could hear her shallow breathing, the way she kept looking at the bookshelf. And then it happened again. Another book fell. This time it felt intentional, like something was responding. That was too much. I stood, not out of courage, but necessity. I had to end it. I loudly call out, "In the name of Jesus, I rebuke you. You're not welcome here. Leave this house now." It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't performative. It was instinct, raw, direct. I had never felt more watched than I did in that moment. Not by my friend, but by something else. She ran from the room, hands trembling, whispering that she couldn't breathe. I followed her to the restroom, where she splashed water on her face and tried not to cry. We didn't talk about spirits after that. We didn't talk much at all. She told me not to leave her alone that night. She begged me to stay, to not mention any more prayers or names, and I stayed, but I didn't sleep. The rest of the night, I sat in silence, watching, listening. The bookshelf never moved again, but something still felt present, lingering. So now I'm stuck here in her apartment, sharing this. How do we deal with this? Will it stop? Should we pray? I don't have the answers. I just know what I felt. And I know books don't fall by themselves. Since that night, I've started doing more research, not just about hauntings, about attachments, about how spiritual energy can dwell in physical objects, in buildings, in trauma. She says she hears things sometime, not voices, not steps, just pressure, movement, shifts in the air. I gave her a cross, blessed. I told her to keep it close, not because it's magic, but because it's a reminder of authority, of light, of protection. Whatever is in that apartment, it didn't just react to our words. It reacted to our belief. It wanted fun. It feeds on fear. I still wonder, if I hadn't spoken up, if I had just sat there, letting fear sink into my bones, would more books have fallen? Would something worse have followed? All I know now is this: not all demons need to show themselves to prove they're real. Sometimes they just need you to talk about them. Story number 12. There are moments in your life when reality bends so hard it never quite snaps back into shape. This is just one of those moments. I was only a child when the darkness in our house started watching me back. He had no eyes, no mouth, no features at all, just a blank, pale face staring straight through me. People say children make things up, that nightmares vanish with age. But what if the nightmare stayed? Years later, another child saw him too. That's when they finally believed me. But by then, it was already too late. I'm going to start by saying that I'm 19 years old now, and these events occurred from ages 7 to 8. I'm not religious at all. I'm one of the kind of people that has to see something to believe it. When people tell me stories or how this or that happened to them, I always try and come up with a logical explanation for what they experienced. That being said, this shook me to my core, and I avoid sharing what happened to me with other people simply because I cannot even think about this time in my life without swelling up in tears. I had always been a rational kid, obsessed with Lego instructions, dinosaur facts, and everything that made sense. But our house didn't care about logic. It whispered at night. It pressed the air cold against my skin, and somewhere between the click of the hallway light and the creak of my door, it watched. My room was at the start of a narrow hallway that bled into darkness no matter how many lights were on. My mom tucked me in every night like clockwork, sitting on the edge of my bed until I fell asleep. But I'd fake it, eyes shut tight, breath steady. Then, when she finally left, I'd flick on every light I could and play silently until the sun rose. I couldn't explain why. I just knew I wasn't safe. The first time I saw him, the air changed before anything else. I was halfway to my mom's room, our nightly routine, when I pushed the door open and stopped cold. An extremely pale, short, bald man sitting in the middle of her bed. I was paralyzed with fear and just stared at the man for a few moments, trying to understand what I was looking at. The man's head picked up and he looked at me as I stood in the doorway. His face was completely smooth, with no eyes, mouth, or anything. Just a powder white face. I couldn't scream at first. I couldn't even breathe. His faceless head tilted just slightly, acknowledging me without acknowledging me. And then I collapsed. The moment I saw him look up at me, I immediately collapsed to the floor and started to scream and cry and call for my mother to wake up. My mom jumped up out of bed and ran over to me and tried to calm me down. I was trying to tell her there was a man in the room, but she kept telling me it was just a bad dream, that I needed to go back to bed. She held me tight, brushing my sweaty hair back and repeating over and over that it was just a nightmare. But it wasn't a nightmare. Nightmares don't breathe. Nightmares don't turn their heads slowly, calculating like they know you better than you know yourself. I looked around the room, intending to show her, but I didn't see the man anymore. Of course he was gone. They always disappear when the lights come on. I begged to have my cousin sleep over that night. I couldn't be alone, not anymore. But that didn't fix the fear. It just moved it to the corners of the room where no one looked. The following nights were horrible. My mother would tuck me into bed like usual and wait until I fell asleep to leave. Except now, I was faking that I was asleep. So, she would go into her room. When she left, I would get up and turn all the lights in my room on and play around with my action figures or play on the PlayStation. I would do this until it was the next morning. The longer this went on, the more my body gave out. I started falling asleep during the day, but Mom didn't like that. She wanted me outside, getting sun, being normal. But normal doesn't live in a house where shadows sit on your bed and watch you. And then it happened again. I had collapsed on the living room couch one afternoon, body too drained to fight anymore. I didn't mean to fall asleep, but I did. And when I opened my eyes, it was dark. No night lights, no hallway glow, just black. Panic swelled fast and heavy, like drowning. I stumbled off the couch, blinking toward the only faint glow I could see, the power light from the TV. I got off the couch and tried to use the power light on the TV to help me have a point of reference to walk to my room. It was the first room on the hall coming out of the living room. When I got to my room and opened the door, the man was sitting on the edge of my bed. He didn't move. He didn't need to. He was waiting. My body acted before I could think. I shut the door slowly, praying he hadn't seen me this time, and then ran. I ran like I was on fire. My mother's door flew open, and I screamed louder than I ever had in my life. She gets up, walks with me to my room, but there wasn't anything there. I remember being so confused at the time and questioning what was real and what was not. She was patient this time, but patient didn't mean believing. I told her I couldn't stay anymore, that I needed to go live with Dad. He didn't believe me either. He also thought I was just having bad dreams because I was watching scary movies at my mother's. But I hadn't. Not a single one. I thought leaving the house would end it, that whatever it was lived in the walls, that it wouldn't follow. And for a while, it didn't. I grew up. I forced it all into a box in my head, locked tight, only leaking through in the form of anxiety and insomnia. That's how trauma works, right? You pretend it didn't happen and hope the pretending becomes real. It did. But then one day, my mom called. Her new husband had 3 kids. The youngest, a 6-year-old, had started waking up screaming, saying the white man was in his room, sitting on the bed, watching him. When my mom told me that he was saying the same things that I was, I wanted to be like, I told you so. But at this point, Mom believed me and sold the house not long after. She called it the haunted house after that. A joke, a nickname. But I never laughed. I still find it hard to talk to other people in person about it for some reason. It makes my eyes water uncontrollably. But I'm so glad I don't have to be anywhere near that house, as I was tortured by that demonic presence for months. Story number 13. There are places where even the air remembers the screams, I saw a woman turn into someone else entirely just by hearing the name of Jesus. That day in Argentina, when the kitchen started breathing, I realized something ancient lived there. She didn't walk to that house. She woke up there. Again and again. The last time I touched her hand, I left a part of myself behind. I never got it back. When I was 19, I volunteered to serve my faith in a country far from home, Argentina. I expected resistance, language barriers, and cultural misunderstandings. I didn't expect to come face to face with something that didn't belong in this world. There was a woman we met who claimed something invisible sat on her head every night. She was dating a man in a dark offshoot of Umbanda and wanted out. Her house was suffocating with dread even before we stepped inside. I sat in the front room where I could see into the kitchen and straight to the back doors. It was silent, but not the peaceful kind. The air was watching. She recounted strange noises, the sensation of being followed, and waking up to things out of place. We chalked it up to paranoia at first, but the house didn't agree. As we listened, the back door began to tremble. A broom fell over. The concrete walls, solid and immovable, began to hum with vibration, and then came the scratching, up and down, just over our heads, like claws testing the surface between their world and ours. We did what we were taught. We prayed. But prayer in that house didn't feel like light-breaking darkness. It felt like challenging something that didn't want to be noticed. And then suddenly, like a taut rope snapped, everything stopped. The air became breathable again. The weight lifted, but not for long. One afternoon, we stopped outside a weathered house and clapped, Argentinian-style door knocking. A woman stumbled out of a side unit, barefoot and confused. Her eyes were unfocused, like she had just emerged from a trance. She looked at us and muttered, "I live across town. I don't know how I got here again." She kept waking up in this house. Her boyfriend's. He practiced something deeper and darker than anything we'd heard before. In his room was a circle where he had sacrificed animals. She told us about dreams, underwater visions, where Lucifer held her down while others surrounded her. Still, she begged for help. Her children had been taken after she was found wandering on a highway in the middle of the night. She didn't remember any of it, claimed she was someone else when it happened. That's when we noticed the switch. Every time we mentioned Christ, her head lowered, her voice dropped several octaves, and she would mutter something in another tongue. Gone was the desperate mother. In her place was someone or something cold and aggressive. I crouched down, held her eyes, and said, "Look at me. See the light of Christ in me." She hissed through her teeth, "You lie." We left, but not before I shook her hand, and all the life in me drained through my fingertips. We staggered away from that house like survivors of a natural disaster. My companion and I didn't speak for hours. We simply sat, motionless, on a curb, staring at nothing. We'd been missionaries. After that, we were survivors. When we finally called our mission president, his voice dropped. "Mark that street. No one goes back there." But Lord, it was the only time in my life I saw fear reach through a phone line. What stayed with me wasn't the demonic presence or the scratches on the wall. It was that feeling of looking into someone's eyes and realizing you're not the only one in there. There was another girl we taught who had played with a Ouija board. I know, it sounds like teen nonsense, but it escalated quickly. One of her friends began convulsing. She smashed a mirror and started writing on the walls in her own blood. Not words, just spirals, sigils, lines that seemed to burn even after being cleaned off. They tried cleansing the place. She said even the dog refused to walk into that room now. One night, the girl called us in a panic. Her friend had vanished, just disappeared. I asked what room she had been in last. She was sitting inside the circle, she said. I never saw that friend again. Some nights I wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, and I swear I hear scratching just beyond the walls of my home. Scratching not quite inside and not quite outside, like something is still trying to get through. Well, I try to rationalize. Maybe trauma, maybe nightmares, maybe just an old man haunted by his own imagination. But then I remember her eyes, not her voice, not her words, her eyes. There was something watching me from inside her, something that recognized me, not as Pret, as a rival. Story number 14. They say you only see what your mind allows. But what if something chooses to let you see it again and again? The night she came the first time, I thought it was just a bad dream, tangled in a case of sleep paralysis. But the second time, there was no sleep, no paralysis, just her, still smiling. There's a kind of smile that crawls under your skin, not violent, not comforting either, just there, like it knows something about you that even you don't. She didn't knock, didn't try to get in. She simply stood there, outside, watching through the screen with the storm screaming behind her. And somehow, the storm wasn't the scariest thing that night. I'm not sure if she wants to hurt me or help me, but she's come back. And I know this won't be the last time. The memory doesn't fade. It lingers in my chest like a breath I never let go. I remember the first time I saw her, and even now, it plays back like a loop I can't shut off. I was home from college, lying in bed. I woke up in the middle of the night and noticed that the hallway light was on. That stood out to me because I rarely turn it on, so I know I didn't. It's possible my dad did, but that would have been unusual. The hallway light spilled into my room like a muted omen. Everything about the scene felt displaced, like waking up in a replica of your room that's just slightly wrong. Peering around the corner was a pale woman with shoulder-length, straight black hair. She was wearing a black and white polka dot dress. She stood motionless, as if someone had placed her there like a doll, forgotten mid-play. The smile on her face wasn't malicious. She smiled at me the entire time, but her expression was slightly uncanny, creepy, and unsettling. Yet the smile also felt oddly genuine. I couldn't move. She didn't move. She just stood there and watched me. It lasted for what felt like forever, but was probably a minute. Then I could breathe. I could move again. The hallway was empty. The experience freaked me out mostly because I have a deep fear of home invasion. But whenever I recall it, I don't feel the same fear I did in that moment. That moment marked the end of something innocent in my life, though I didn't realize it then. It wasn't until months later that I saw her again, when everything changed. I live in Central Florida, and last week, Hurricane Milton came clawing through the coast like it had a grudge against every roof and a tree in its path. We were lucky. Our house stayed dry. The power held. But peace is a funny illusion. My bedroom has a large window, and I've always been paranoid about it during storms. Something about glass shattering while I sleep unnerves me, so I took refuge on the living room couch, nestled far from anything fragile. My cat, Indy, curled up near me, jittery from the howling wind. That night, I woke up abruptly, not paralyzed, just alert. I know I wasn't in sleep paralysis because I immediately began petting my cat, who was anxious from the noise. That's when I noticed the patio. There she was. The same woman, same hair, same black and white polka dot dress, same smile. I looked out the back door, and there she was, standing in the middle of our serene-dim patio. No light shined on her, yet she was perfectly visible, like she belonged in the darkness. I stared at her, unblinking. I stared at her, then looked at the lock to make sure it was secure, and back at her. She didn't move. I remember the moment I blinked, just once, and she was gone. After a minute or two, it was like I blinked and she was gone. But I didn't feel fear the second time, not the same kind. It was something colder, something that didn't care whether I screamed or stayed silent. Since then, I've spent days trying to rationalize it. I combed Reddit threads, called in to local radio paranormal shows anonymously, even spoke to a woman who claimed to be medium. No one had answers that felt solid. I'd have been turning it over in my mind constantly. The only explanation I can think of is maybe a force awakening or a stress-induced hallucination. I consider myself spiritual, but don't have deep knowledge about anything more specific in that realm. But hallucinations don't come back in the same dress, with the same smile months apart during two entirely different physical states. I've reviewed security footage, nothing. She doesn't show up in recordings. I even bought motion sensors. They never went off. She doesn't want to be seen by machines, only me. And deep down, some primal, instinctual part of me believes she isn't a hallucination. She's something else. I want to understand more who or what she is and why she was appearing to me. I feel like she's here for a reason, but I have no idea why. I started dreaming of her. Except in the dreams, she's not standing still. She moves closer each time, never fast, never aggressive, just slowly closing the gap. And the closer she gets, the more details I notice. Her dress isn't polka dots, it's eyes. Hundreds of tiny, open, unblinking eyes. She whispers things I can't hear but feel, things I wake up knowing but can't put into words. I've started hearing static when I'm alone. No TV, no radio, just a vibration in the air, like something waiting to speak. Sometimes I catch myself smiling for no reason. The same kind of smile. Last night, the power flickered, not from weather, just a sudden pulse. When it came back, all the clocks in my house were flashing 3:33 a.m. That was the time I first saw hers. I stood up, looked out the back window. She wasn't there. She was in the hallway again. This time, she took one step forward, and I swear I felt something inside me take one step back. She's not gone. She's never gone. And I don't think she's here to hurt me. But she's here for something, and I think the next time she comes, I'll finally understand what. Story number 50. They say childhood shapes you. What they don't tell you is, so does the darkness hiding underneath your babysitter's house. Have you ever been drowned by invisible hands while someone bathed you? Because I have. That was my welcome to 966 Lindy Street. When I was 6, a stuffed bear floated 6 feet into the air in front of me and winked. I never wanted to go into that basement, but she led me there anyway. Macy, smiling like she knew what lived beneath. I'm writing this not because I want to. I write because if I don't, it might find someone else. My mother had me when she was 15, and by the time I turned 6, she was neck-deep in a motorcycle gang. Their house was chaos, bottles on the floor, men with dead eyes lounging on torn couches, and engines roaring through the night. She couldn't handle me. So she sent me to stay with Laura and Jerry Gooden. The address, 966 Lindy Street, Bridgeport. People who lived nearby avoided the place. But I didn't know better. I was just a kid looking for a clean meal and a bed. I thought the real nightmare was the gang I'd left behind. I was wrong. Laura seemed nice. She offered to bathe me, and I trusted her. But while I was sitting in that tub, something slammed the door shut. The room went ice cold. I opened my mouth to call for help. That's when invisible hands forced me underwater. My lungs screamed. I thrashed. The water turned thick like syrup. Everything blurred until suddenly I was floating. Not breathing, just drifting toward unconsciousness. Then air. I jolted up, coughing, and Laura screamed. What happened? I had no words, just water in my lungs. And a shadow burned into my memory. Macy was their adopted daughter, and Macy was wrong. She spoke in monotones and always stared at the corners of rooms as if someone was standing there, as if they were whispering to her. One afternoon, she invited me to her room. I stepped inside and froze. The air shimmered like a heat wave. Stuffed animals were floating, dozens of them, circling her like a twisted carousel. She said nothing, just smiled. Then she whispered, "Come to the basement." I said no, but that night, while everyone slept, my body moved on its own. My legs carried me to the door, down the creaking steps, into the blackness below. Halfway down, a force wrapped around my ankles and pulled me so hard, I hit every step like a rag doll. When I landed, the shadows gathered in the far corner. They twisted, moved, formed arms, shoulders, a head. It lunged, and I couldn't scream. It wrapped around my throat and squeezed until my eyes dimmed. And then, just before I passed out, it let go. I crumpled to the floor, choking and shaking. Macy was already there. She just stood at the top of the stairs. watching. Things escalated. Doors moved when no one touched them. The heat would be on, but the air would feel like a freezer. I once saw my breath in the living room. In August, then came the cat. His name was Sam. He'd perch on the windowsill, eyes glowing in the dark. One day, while I played with Legos on the carpet, he turned to me and said, "Jingle bells." My heart stopped. I ran to Jerry. "The cat talks." He laughed. Until a week later, when Sam said something else, something that made even the adults pale. "You're all going to die." His mouth didn't move, but the words hung in the air, like a curse spoken through time. The police were called. Furniture moved on its own. A 300-pound fridge lifted 3 inches off the ground. A crucifix twisted on the wall while a cop stared, mouth agape. One officer left. He couldn't handle it. The rest tried to rationalize it. Then Ed and Lorraine Warren arrived. They didn't flinch. Lorraine said, "This house is not haunted. It is possessed." They left, and soon after, everything was written off as a hoax. Macy took the blame, said she faked it all. But I saw her face, blank, detached, and I knew the truth. We hadn't survived a haunting. We'd survived a possession, and something still followed me. Years passed, but the darkness didn't leave. I'd wake at night drenched in sweat, hearing voices that didn't belong in this world. Who's to it? Things broke around me. People said I had rage issues, but it wasn't rage, it was them. I nearly hurt someone once, a man who didn't deserve it. That was the turning point. I contacted the New England Society for Paranormal Research. I was desperate, hollow, dangerous. In 2023, they agreed to help. Archbishop Plato Angelicus and Father James arrived with holy water and Latin prayers. I sat in a chair, hands bound, not by them, but by choice. As they began, the air changed, heavy, unforgiving. When they touched me with water, it burned. Not metaphorically, my skin blistered. They chanted in Latin. I screamed in something that wasn't my voice. Time lost the meaning. Minutes became hours. I convulsed. My body lifted from the chair and slammed back down. I saw Macy's face in flashes, the shadow from the basement, and then silence. It was over. I cried like a child, not from pain, but from relief. For the first time in decades, I felt light. Some people believe me, others never will. But I write this because someone out there is being followed too. There is hope. There is help. And even in the darkest places, there's a way out. Story number 6. They say the internet is a mirror to the soul. But that night it showed me something else entirely. A reflection not of humanity, but of something far more sinister. Have you ever stared at a stranger's face until it stopped looking human? I didn't mean to, but I swear what I saw wasn't a glitch. It was a mask slipping. It wasn't the shadows that moved. It wasn't the lighting or the filter. Her smile grew in slow degrees, wide and wet, like it wasn't made for a human face. No one else noticed it. I scrolled through hundreds of comments, heart emojis, so helpful. You're glowing, Queen, but no one said a word about her changing face. Only I saw it, only me, and I wish I hadn't, because Now, every time I blink, I see her. I see it. And I'm starting to think this wasn't some glitch in the app. It was a glimpse behind the curtain. It had been another exhausting day, and I was doing what everyone does to unwind, mindlessly scrolling Instagram until sleep won the battle. Influencers, food reels, memes, rinse and repeat, nothing unusual. I was just on Instagram doom scrolling before bed and I stopped on this video. Some girl, pretty in that manufactured way, was talking about the top 5 hydrating foods you should eat this summer. Typical wellness content. Cucumber, watermelon, probably a sponsored ad. I didn't even like the video. Something about her vibe felt wrong. Her smile was too still, her tone too rehearsed. But that's normal, right? We've all grown numb to inauthentic people on camera. But then her face began to change. Well, at first, I assumed it was a filter glitch or my tired eyes. But as the seconds passed, the features shifted in ways that felt unnatural. Not in a funny filter way. No dusk ears, no flower crowns. No, this was subtle, insidious. Her eyes got really big and her mouth got wide. It started happening so subtly, I couldn't figure out if I was actually seeing it or not. I paused the video, then restarted it. Same thing, but only when I watched closely. It was like her face remembered something mine forgot, something primordial and ancient that should have stayed hidden. And I kept watching, like a fly too curious to escape the web. I scrolled down to the comments, looking for some sanity. I checked the comments to see if anyone else said anything. My guess was she was using a filter, or maybe it was supposed to be a joke or something like Uncanny Valley horror stuff. But nothing. Just a stream of praise. No mention of the distorted face. Not even a question. Glowing skin. I love this list. You're radiant. Was I hallucinating? To test myself, I opened a few other influencer videos. Guys with gym routines. Girls talking about gut health. Random comedy skits. No one else had the weird morphing effect. If it was with everyone, I would assume it was like having a mental breakdown. But no one else looked that way, just her. It was really scary. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, closed the app, reopened it. The video was gone. Not in my history, not saved in my likes. No trace in the search tab, as if it had never existed. And that's when something ice cold settled into my chest. Maybe it wasn't a filter glitch. Maybe I wasn't tired, and maybe I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Not the girl. What was inside the girl? That thing behind her smile? I fell down rabbit holes. Forums, Reddit threads, TikToks about demon face syndrome. Most of it sounded like attention-seeking garbage. People claiming their webcams caught shadows moving or that their friends weren't blinking right. I've heard rumblings about the demon face syndrome that's been happening. I thought it was just a bunch of creepy pasta nonsense. But the image of that woman's face haunted me. Her expanding eyes, her hungry grin. There was a pattern to it. She wasn't trying to be scary. That's what made it worse. Some spiritual TikTokers say certain people can see through the veil. That social media, through its endless loops and filters, accidentally reveals what's behind the mask of the world. non-human entities masquerading as influencers to feed on attention, to harvest our gaze like it's fuel. I've heard spiritual people on social media talk about certain individuals having the ability to see non-human beings. But again, I thought it was BS and didn't really put much stock into it. Until now. That night, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing on my nightstand, a notification. You may like this video. So, it was her again. Same thumbnail, same empty smile, but the caption was different. You're ready now. My phone froze. I tried swiping, locking, restarting, nothing worked. The video played automatically. Only this time, she didn't speak. She just stared into the lens, and slowly her face began to distort into this really weird version of herself. Her skin stretched as if her bones didn't fit right. Her pupils dilated into vertical slits. Her mouth parted in a grin too wide, too knowing. Then she blinked, but not like a human. She blinked sideways, and she whispered, "Now you see us." Since that night, things haven't felt real. Gosh, faces in public morph for half seconds. Smiles linger too long. Reflections in store windows show people whose mouths don't move when they talk. I stopped using social media, but I swear they still find me. She finds me, and sometimes I wonder, was she ever real? Or was she the first to let the others in? What does it mean? Was she some sort of demon? If you're reading this, be careful who you watch online. Some of them are watching back. Story number 70. I always thought the devil would come for sinners, not scared kids sleeping beneath dusty ceilings. But when the ground opened beneath me, I stopped being a child that night. What woke me wasn't noise. It was silence, the unnatural kind, thick and watching. That kind of silence only happens before things break. Monsters don't always crawl from under your bed. Sometimes they knock on the walls of your house and wait for no one to answer. There's a moment where panic becomes instinct, and instinct becomes survival. I learned that between heartbeats and shifting floorboards the night I thought I met the devil. I learned something worse. How it feels when everyone laughs at your terror. Sleepovers in our family were rarely about fun. They were chaotic carnivals of sarcasm, spilled soda, and bruised egos. Everyone packed into mismatched rooms with lumpy pillows and borrowed blankets. There were 4 of us. I was in my room, asleep on my bed, and my 3 guy cousins were on the floor of my room. That detail alone meant the night would go sideways. Every time they stayed over, they treated me like the runt of the litter. Not outright evil, but creatively cruel. My older cousins were always very mean to me growing up. They used to invite me over to hang out with them and then either beat me or play some prank or try to humiliate me. One time, they locked me in the shed and convinced me it was haunted. Another time, they switched out my shampoo with ketchup. But that's a story for another time. So when that night started with fake snoring and giggles under the covers, I knew I wouldn't rest easy. But what I didn't know was how quickly a prank could turn into something real, something violent. The clock must have passed midnight. That's when the air in the room thickened, like the atmosphere decided to wrap itself around my throat. Then a noise. I heard something that sounded like a chandelier's jewels jingling. My mom was known to have a few downstairs, And at first, it was faint, delicate, like soft metal brushing against itself. But in that moment, it felt massive, like the sound filled the walls from the inside out. I waited for someone to stir. I woke up and looked around my room. Something felt off. It was way too quiet. Why was everyone asleep? Didn't they hear it? They didn't. And that's what made it worse. When fear creeps in and you're the only one who feels it, it grows teeth. I sat up. The sheets beneath me felt warm, too warm. My mouth dried as if I hadn't spoken in days. I scanned the ceiling, then the corners. Shadows shifted slightly with the glow from the nightlight, but nothing obvious moved. That's when the bed began to tremble. And at first, I thought maybe it was me, shaking, cold, nerves, imagination. But then the frame of the bed creaked under its own weight. The mattress tilted ever so slightly. It felt like a breath underneath me, long, slow, and living. I stared at the floor. My cousins slept like stones, arms tossed, mouths ajar, useless. Was I the only one awake because I was the one being hunted? A sudden image flashed in my mind. Carrie, thrashing in her bed, possessed and helpless. Something's in this room, I thought, and it wants me. The tremors got worse. My pillows slid toward the foot of the bed. My eyes darted to the wall where Mom's frame painting hung. It swayed like it was on a boat. I knew I had to leave, but getting off the bed meant stepping over them, crawling past the same boys who tied my shoelaces together last week, who once dared me to pee outside at night and then locked the door behind me. I couldn't risk waking them. They'd never let me forget it. So I stood on the bed, heart pounding, body tensed. Then I jumped. I leapt across the room, barely missing my cousin Marcus's forehead. My knees hit the carpet and pain shot up my legs, but I didn't stop. I bolted toward my mom's room, like every shadow behind me had grown fingers. I didn't care how loud I was. I didn't care if the whole street woke up. I just needed to get out. I pounded on her door. I screamed. I begged. Nothing. I called her name again and again. I scratched the wood with my nails. I waited for a click, anything that meant I was safe. But the door stayed shut, buddy-foot. And then the world lurched. Well, not just the bed, not just the room, the house, every brick, every joint, every mirror, twitched like something massive had decided to roll beneath us. A photo fell in the hallway behind me. I heard one of my cousins stir and groan. The tremors didn't stop. They got angrier, more erratic. I curled into a ball near the door and covered my ears. I couldn't cry. I couldn't scream. I just held myself and whispered, "Please, not me." The door opened suddenly. My mom stood there, yawning. Then she laughed, like this was nothing, like her child hadn't been out here pleading for his life. Behind her, the hallway lights flicked on. My cousins stumbled out, bleary-eyed and confused. "What's going on?" I looked up, face streaked with tears and dust. They saw me, and they laughed. Even Marcus, the one I nearly landed on. One by one, they joined my mom, amused that I had lost it over a little shaking. As my sister emerged from her room and frowned. She knelt beside me and pulled me into her arms. "I felt it too," she whispered. She was the only one who didn't mock me. They told me later it was an earthquake. a rare one. Richter scale reading, somewhere around 5 point something. The news showed cracked pavement, glass storefronts. Nothing major, no deaths, just movement. But that night, it didn't feel like geology. It felt personal. For years, they teased me. Devil almost got you that night, huh? I laughed along eventually. But every time the floor shakes, train, thunder, construction, I freeze. My body remembers what my mind tries to forget. I know what they said. I know science. But some nights, when I'm half asleep and everything gets quiet again, I still hear those chandelier crystals start to move. And I wonder, what if it wasn't just the earth,